Hello, hello.
Hello.
How are things over there?
Oh, I think everybody's moving a little slow because they were all up late last night.
Right,
Bunch of
right,
people
right, right.
watching the ads for the sports ball game. There are a few people who are watching the sports ball, but most of us just watching the ads.
Oh,
I watched the show in between, like just an hour ago while on the treadmill. But yeah, I'm not too much into football, I must admit. But I watched the game at the latter once like 10 years ago, and I was surprised how many breaks there are in between. But yeah,
It is not like European football.
no.
For some reason, we don't play with our feet. Don't know what's up with it.
Yep.
But yeah, it is a game designed for advertising, and so it is. I used to watch it a long time ago, and I've gotten fairly turned off to it for lots of reasons. So this was the one game of the year that I actually did watch.
And Taylor Swift won. Or the Kansas City Chiefs, I think. Yeah, it's funny, the dynamics of it. But I guess like initially it was a smart idea to have this 1 hour game being interrupted every time something boring happens. So that it's kind of a fair thing at the end of the day. I don't know. Like sounds if you contrast it with soccer, right? You can like dribble in your field and the clock runs out. So
I mean, you do have ways to run the clock out if you want to. It's just very interesting if they have designed the game so much that you can slow it down so much, and they've got intentional game breaks just for the advertisers thrown in there where you just don't see that in other games out there.
yeah. And isn't it like the 49ers is owned by one billionaire family and the Kansas City Chiefs by another billionaire family?
They're all, every one of them.
Yeah,
And I don't
funny.
like the billionaire that owns my local team. So all the more
There
reason
we
not to pay
go.
attention to it.
I forgot about the login thing, and then I wasn't logged in, and then I needed to find my two-factor, and I couldn't, so I was running around like a monkey with their head cut off. Chicken with their head cut off. Were you talking about the Super Bowl?
Sports ball, Super Bowl.
Let's see. Alrighty, I made it. Oh, Brandon's gone. There's a ladder behind you. What do you do with that ladder, Brandon? Climb up to the top of your bookshelf that's not a real bookshelf.
I think it's not a real ladder. I hate to break
Not
it
a
to you, but
no.
yeah, sorry. But it's smart, like this blurred bookshelf. I think that's maybe I need to polish up my Zoom as well with such a thing. Looks
Yeah, it
very good.
reminds me from like Beauty and the Beast when she's in the library and she like climbs up the bookshelf and she like goes along. That's Brandon actually. Brandon climbs up his digital fake ladder and reenacts Beauty and the Beast.
Cool.
hey guys, I think we can start. We have one topic for today, which is proposals review. Since it looks like all the proposals that has been created are already in the review state, I think it makes sense that we start talking about that. So I would suggest that first let's go over proposals in alphabetical order and confront them against the requirements we define.
Yeah, and I want to kind of reiterate something that I said in the Slack that, and actually a point that Brandon made very, very early on, that ultimately we will probably put together different components of proposals that we like into a new turducken proposal. And I think it's really important that we focus on this process we're going to go through as not being an adversarial one, as remembering that we're working together to figure out the best specification. Because I think when there's a situation where like this, where people kind of get attached to a proposal and then it becomes, they get defensive, and we just have to remember that we are working together on the same team here. So take it away.
Sure. Yeah, that's definitely makes sense. I mean, if you want, you can trash my proposals as long as our requirements are kind of, implemented or somehow served. So yeah, let's talk about that. So let's share my screen, because I think the proposal A from Brandon will be kind of fast.
I didn't have a lot in my proposal, but
yeah, that's why it's a good
to what
proposal.
Vanessa was saying, completely agree, but also pick my proposal.
So do you want to give a short introduction maybe for Bjorn and others that, not sure if Bjorn had the time to go through the proposals, but maybe we can have some kind of introduction of the proposals from the authors.
Yeah, mine, I kept it probably as simple as I could. I leveraged annotations on the descriptor and the manifest list. So you've got your list of manifests there. You can just add one or more annotations in there, and that can be owned by some organization. We might have some that might be OCI specific, might have some things that NVIDIA puts out, or AMD and Intel. Pick all the different vendors of something that might want to put their own details in there. And then the selection process would be the runtime looks through all the different entries in there. If the runtime isn't configured to know any better, it's just going to pick the first entry. And that's the way it does it now. That's fully backward compatible. It just says, hey, you got 2 entries for the AMD 64. I don't know the difference between the two. I'm just going to take the first one. If there is something that the runtime is configured to look for, it would prioritize that. And so you can configure the runtime. The proposal here is suggesting that runtimes could be configured on an individual installation basis to say this runtime is looking for the NVIDIA implementations, the images that are just for NVIDIA. It would go looking through there, find its entry, and then prefer that one over the others. And so you can have some kind of priority in there in terms of maybe you weight different annotations, you look for different values in there, but effectively that's all I did was I kind of put it in there as a weighted annotation the runtimes can look at. If they see multiple, they can maybe potentially add them together. All of those are runtime specific rules. So runtimes can pick and choose how they want to implement this, but that's the goal, is that they just look at annotations. It's entirely managed by the runtime deciding how they want to weight the annotation, and the person doing the build figuring out what annotations they need to add to differentiate their different images. And so if you build 2 different images and one of them is specific for NVIDIA, you're going to add the annotation that says, here's my image just for the NVIDIA platform. And so that's part of you as the builder that will just add that one extra annotation. So it's not the broad reaching trying to incorporate every single possible annotation for every single possible compatibility in there. It's saying the image builder knows specifically why they made 3 different images. And so they're going to put the annotations on there to differentiate those 3 different images, because that's how they built the overall multi-platform structure. So I think I went on and on about that enough for a very short proposal. Anybody have questions?
No questions from my side. So we are covered, at least by this proposal. For me, it's a good compromise for runtime image selection, that we don't have to force other runtimes that they execute some kind of complicated plugins that they have to, I don't know, support more complicated image selections. Because I was wondering about how we can improve this in the runtime image selection. And I thought at the beginning to provide these plugins that can execute and extract some additional information from the host. But if we are moving this responsibility to sysadmin that they configure annotations on the container runtime and the image index side, then it's fine by me.
There are two places that this could get a little bit more advanced. And one of those is that you might have a specific runtime that knows that I'm the NVIDIA runtime. And so I'm going to look for the NVIDIA annotation myself. And it's going to do that specifically. The other places that when we look at how this is actually implemented, there is a difference between containerd picking the image and run C kicking off and executing it. And so the actual NVIDIA execution is a whole different runtime that gets triggered off. And so there may need to be some extra information in there that tells the runtime, that tells something like containerd. I know you might have multiple runtimes to pick from. Here's how you should be picking and choosing which one would be better.
I mean, I think that's not as much a concern because, like, on the one hand, like, yeah, there's room for a higher order abstraction there. But I think that ultimately, like, you know, the interpreting the image config, that's always been the job of the high level runtime, or whatever you want to call the thing that generates the runtime bundle. So on the one hand, like, I don't think anything's fundamentally shifted there. But on the other hand, like, I think that's not a great example just because we're increasingly getting away from the NVIDIA RunC model. And, you know, the two primary ways to execute a container with GPU support right now that are encouraged, I would say, are one, the NVIDIA container toolkit being baked into your runtime, which is like the Podman and Docker GPUs flag, but then also CDI is in theory the way we're going. And instead that NVIDIA container toolkit is some external binary, which is just injected into that OCI config bundle as a hook. But
so as it exists today, is it on the deployment engineer when you make your Kubernetes manifest, your Docker Compose file, whatever you're executing, to pass a flag that says, I want to execute this image with the GPU enabled?
yes. So that would be like like using CDI as the example of like the direction that NVIDIA and Intel are pushing. They generate some JSON manifest, kind of like CNI plugins in a well-known location, and then you pass a -- devices flag, for example, that references an entry in those manifests, and then that triggers the config modification, hook injection, etc.
So kind of the direction I'm leaning is, instead of having that entirely on the deployment engineer, could that be a shared responsibility where the deployment engineer might say, all these runtimes are available, pick the best one, and the image itself would be able to say, I've got these 3 different implementations. And so you can pick and choose any of them that makes the most sense. And so the image itself
think
gives you information about what runtimes you can pick.
And like the question mark there, I think, would just be whether or not like CDI gains some like structure annotation or whatnot that helps it match a device to an image, or whether, like, as a containerd administrator, I would configure some TOML file that specifies the, you know, I have used this hardware device for this class of NVIDIA GPU expressed in the image config. But like, I guess what I'm getting at is that, like, I still think that like, however you slice it, whether, you know, you compile NVIDIA's code into your process, whether you use a forked RunC or you use a framework like CDI for hooking in that third-party code, it still happens in the same place. So I guess what I'm saying is, like, I don't think it's a departure from the current model. It's just we don't actually have a way to even design those mappings today. But ultimately, where those decisions are made lies in the same place.
I think there's a problem here. Actually, this is probably shared by a lot of the proposals of one that is cultural, in the sense that, you know, what exactly are those annotations? Arguably, this doesn't, correct me if I'm wrong, but this doesn't really change anything. We already have the ability to add annotations, and someone could put their special annotations there and use them for compatibility, but that's not being done. So the question is, why is it not being done? And so if we have something like this, then we would also potentially need to have a strategy for saying, okay, what are the namespaces of those annotations? Who's maintaining them? What happens when they change? So I guess this doesn't feel like it's anything new, if that makes sense. It feels like it would just be the same thing that we have now. But maybe there'd be, I don't know. What do folks think about?
Did we have annotations on the manifest list level? I'm not sure.
Yeah, we
Yes.
do.
They exist
So-
today,
so
this
but-
is. Go ahead, you.
Oh, I was just going to say, like, I think it goes back to, and this is maybe what Brandon was going to say. I think it goes back to one of Brandon's original statements or maybe thesis at the start of this, which is that maybe it's not necessarily any changes or improvement to the format, but it's entirely a socio-technical infrastructure to define structured annotations, how to interpret them, where do I go, how do I discover what annotations exist, who are the groups that, have an interest in maintaining this set of annotations, and example, decision graphs or code for how to interpret them, how to action them. Like essentially, we have the ability to stuff semi-structured data in, but we're not taking advantage of it because somebody needs to evangelize that, document it, and try to enforce some level of standardization.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I guess the follow-up question is where do we draw the line in terms of what our working group is responsible for in terms of kind of leading that cultural change? Because that seems like the harder problem here. We can say, okay, everyone, put your metadata and annotations, and then nothing changes, right? There almost needs to be a second part, but on the other hand, like I'm not sure how much control we have of that.
I think there's like two passes, right? I mean, we want something that we can see on the or image index level, which is maybe a fast way of figuring out what images we can kick out and what we need to look into maybe in a deeper sense. And we need to define those entry points and those broader decision snippets that we can fix or that we can fetch. So, I mean, we can do this today, right? But we need to, as you said, Vanessa, we need to define what is the annotation that hints towards a certain runtime or a certain outcome. And maybe we have those annotations as an early hint. So if you're on a site with vendor X, model Y, then you can put this in so that it's an indication that if you look for this hardware, then you will find it here. And we might have a hint towards another structure that has more information and more decision information to be crunched once you have it trimmed down to only a couple of images and not the 20 images that are in the image index.
Yeah, I would argue that the actual annotations themselves, this is going to be a question that we have to answer across these different proposals. There's going to be namespaces and video, whatever. And I guess I've been thinking that we should be more agnostic to the annotations themselves because those are going to change over time. Like, I'm not saying that NVIDIA won't be a company in 10 years, but maybe it won't, who knows, and there'll be a different annotation. So I think maybe what would make sense is to move forward and assess the proposal in the context of the requirements that we had. And because I think we're going into details that are sort of shared across proposals about, like, for example, the specific having these annotations.
Yeah, to the original point there, this doesn't have a lot of meat to it. There's a single sentence in there that was added. If you scroll up to the top of where the image spec is, there's a line that says, scroll past it already, runtimes may be configured to prefer manifest, right there, the 3 lines above your screen. Runtimes may be configured to prefer manifest with specific annotations. That's the entirety of the spec change right there. Everything else already exists as part of the spec.
And arguably that's not even necessary because, it's kind of implicit in the gray area of the spec that, right, like
it's
runtimes may do whatever. If they have if they know better, they can pick whatever platform they want. Otherwise, they should take the first match. But it makes it more explicit and perhaps, would be a good opportunity to link out to like the compatibility specification and standardization community or whatever it becomes that exists.
Yeah. The main goal of this was just giving guidance to people that are trying to make that decision and be more granular, that this is the direction to use if you're trying to select multiple images from a manifest list. Instead of trying to do anything else in there, we have annotations, please use them, and please be responsible of picking it within a namespace that makes the most sense for each annotation.
Yeah, and to Vanessa's point, like on the one hand, like, it's hard because like if this is the direction that we go, I mean, to me as somebody who works on the runtime side, this is, I mean, I think it's been clear that this is my opinion what makes the most sense. But then it's a lot of time trying to figure out like there's further work that is more squishy than technical, because it's figuring out like, okay, how do we discover new annotation communities? How do we evangelize this to people, document them? Sure, they're, how do we make it easy for them to get started, to give them like a template set of documents? And, like, it's hard, because if you just tell people like it's a blank slate and you do whatever we want, and like we'll just tell people to go talk to you, like that's really no help. And certainly like my sidebar discussion there in the chat, like this is what we saw with Kubernetes, or at least like, I wasn't one of the people involved in creating Cry, and I've only talked to people who were, but it was very early brought on up in the Kubernetes world, as I understand it, of like, how are we going to handle selecting platforms? And annotations were added to the Kubernetes, to the CRI image spec message as a way of like, oh yeah, we'll just use annotations, it's like to do, but okay, yeah, we'll solve this use case by doing that. Like 5 or 6 years after CRI became widely used, and that's still not something that anybody's really trying to solve. And, indeed, Kubernetes has a little bit of a problem there with like Kubernetes is bad at image specification because Kubernetes doesn't know how to do it. It just delegates the underlying runtime with a reference string. And then, reference strings are loosely standardized and entirely up to the subjective interpretation of the runtime implementation. Which is, CRI really doesn't solve a lot of the problems that people think it solves. And yeah, that gets rediscovered quite often, I find. But point being that, like, I think that's an example of where the like, yeah, we'll just pack that information into the annotations goes wrong. And certainly there has to be a lot of effort to actually, get people to use that and come to consensus on how to interpret it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Another, I think another thing we should do is go through what requirements aren't met. I think a really strong one for me is the fact that only the person that is building the image can put the annotations there. And often the company, the person, whatever that is actually pushing the images to the registry is not the one that's most incentivized to work on that compatibility specification. So for example, for this proposal, I don't know if that requirement is somewhere here, but I think it could be a potential weakness that it is only under the jurisdiction of one person, as opposed to being able to have a compatibility artifact that is, pushed by someone else that describes the image that could still be used.
So the person that has write access to the repository can update the index and create a new image with the same underlying images in there, but just a new index. That's
right,
the
but they
same write
probably
access
may
you
not
need.
want to. Right.
That's the same.
So,
that's the same write access you would need if you were going to push a refer that was external to the image. You'd need write access to refer either way.
But so for example, just to give a quick example, I've been running experiments that have separate artifacts from the images. And this is just totally a prototype. So they're totally separate in that, like, that's not even refers. I have my own manifest list that's like, this image is with this compatibility artifact. And arguably, I could do this anyway without a working group specification, but I'm empowered to basically put all of the metadata that I need about this specific image that I may not have any control over, to write refers, to write annotations, whatever, for my particular use cases. So I guess for me, that's why something that is I guess we're going to get into this, but for me, that's why a separate artifact is appealing, because even if you still have that case where we are using refers, if an off sort of brand use case would be like, okay, well, you can actually just still have your own version of a compatibility artifact to describe an image, even if it's not in the refers, as long as you link them together.
Well,
does that make sense?
I mean, I guess my question there would be like, I guess I fail to see what the utility or purpose of that would be, or like the practicality. Maybe I should say practicality, just because the whole point of refers is content discovery. And if you can't discover that in an automated fashion, if you can't discover the relationship, then you have to have some out of band method for knowing that,
That's
I can
true.
go retrieve content that annotates or modifies this content from another location. And at that point, like, that's not something that, like, I don't know that makes sense here, just because that's not something that can be standard and universal, if that makes sense. Like, that's,
yeah, so I can give a couple
non-portable.
of examples. So for actually outside of container images, we have lots of package managers that have binary caches. So this is literally a binary cache, like SPAC, for example, where you push stuff. To describe the stuff in the binary cache, you may want to maintain, you know, compatibility artifacts that are separate from, like the people that maintain the binary cache are not going to want to pay for storing your artifacts. They may not be interested in the same metadata that you're interested in. So you're totally right. You would have to maintain the linking somewhere else, but I guess I don't see that as an unreasonable thing to do. The same is true for images. So like images that, you know, I don't know, NVIDIA maintains, they may just care about, okay, this needs this GPU driver. We're NVIDIA, we do GPUs, and that's all that we care about. But actually, I want to know more about that. I want to know about the application inside. I want to apply labels from ArchSpec and open containers that it fit for the HPC use case. And so even if the working group doesn't come up with a solution that I'm able to do that, you know, by pushing, you know, to NVIDIA's registry, there should be a way that allows me to do that. Otherwise, I just am stopped in my tracks, and all of a sudden I cannot select a compatible image for my use case on high performance computing.
Are you pushing your refers to a different registry, a different repository than where the image is stored?
Not right now. Actually, right now I just have the same exact name, and I just add comp spec to the end because I'm lazy. But you theoretically could.
Because if they're in the same repo, you've got write access to make your own index.
But
it will change your digest.
I think what Vanessa's saying, right? So I mean, on the one hand, like I'm 100% with Brandon of like, I can just modify, I can create a manifest list that is modified, that is my manifest list that still references the same underlying content. And like, if it was in the same registry, then I could do a cross repository blob mount, or if it wasn't, then I would have to syndicate those layers over. But I think what Vanessa's saying, Brandon, is that she has an out of band method, like a tag schema in this case. Say it sounds like it's maybe like the what do you call it? The SigStore tag schema of just the digest of the content plus compatibility spec, for example, that she uses to discover that content. And as long as like, you know, there's, so this sounds like this is for the use case of like not necessarily portability between implementations, but one implementation that happens to use like one unified implementation, say SPAC, that happens to use the registry as a portable method of storing and retrieving content. So it's like almost an inverted use case of like one client, many registries that it wants to store this data in, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's right. And the other kind of thing that I think is important to note is that not every time you have like a binary cache, it's in a registry actually. So the SPAC binary cache is in like S3 somewhere, right? But actually we still want to be able to push, you know, these artifacts to, for example, an OCI registry, because SPAC does use ORAS, which is really great. So I think I am good with a lot of these different solutions that we're proposing or that we'll be talking about, but I think we need to make sure that folks that are still empowered to address these sort of out of band use cases, because even though they're considered out of band in the sense like, well, this isn't, you know, someone pulling down an NVIDIA image, they are still a huge percentage of what communities need, such as high performance computing.
But do we, I mean, isn't it that if you can create, of course you can create your own manifest list, but if you want to do that, as you said, you need to have all the layers in the same manifest, in the same registry that you push your image, your manifest list to, right? So if you want to just annotate or create a compatibility definition for an NVIDIA image, you would need to download all those and then push it into your registry. Isn't there a possibility, like, is it with references, can we do it in a way that you store just your compatibility definitions in your registry and you use upstream for almost all the images, because you don't want to keep in sync with what NVIDIA offers or what AMD offers or what Cray offers in the future? Is there a way of only storing what's important to you?
It gets into a gray area with refers because the APIs themselves are designed to look for stuff that exists in the same repo, but it doesn't mean you couldn't theoretically put your refers in a different repo as long as your runtime tool knows to look in that other repo for it. So you have
if it
to
knows
your runtime for that.
If it knows how to discover that content, which refers doesn't solve But I do think the example of like keeping up with isn't really that. I don't think that's a real concern because, and this is where like I fundamentally, you know, disagree with a lot of people in the container ecosystem about the focus on digested content versus tags. I think tags are very useful. I've had many discussions about this with Brandon, but my point being that like there is no keeping up with, just in that you have an immutable set of, you know, digests. So once you have the content, you have the content. I think the practical concern with that is more that, yeah, okay, like if I was just to say like pull this modified manifest list, it's available at my internal registry, according to today's OCI model, like, and how manifest and content discovery don't have to work, but how they work today, I need to get it from the same registry I got the manifest from. There's no hard constraint on that. It's just that today that's how things are expected to work and what the distribution spec and image spec kind of imply. Like, I don't even think that's really strong language. That's just the assumption that everybody has that reads it. And that's the assumption that was made when those specs were written. So, I mean, you know, technically, like, oh, we could add, like, it's entirely possible we like bring back foreign layers, but make it, you know, foreign manifests. We could do that, I guess, to say like, you know, this manifest list reference content that lives in another registry, because we actually had a mechanism for that for layers, because of Microsoft concerns, that is now deprecated. But
Really? I did not know that. When was that?
yeah, there's a whole princesses in another castle mechanism that nobody was happy with, but had to exist at the time. And that was actually, I think it was last year, Brandon, that like Sajay was like, hey, very happy to say everybody that we're not going to be doing foreign layers anymore. And like Microsoft lawyers have been wrangled into being okay with this.
And everybody rejoiced. It was
Yeah.
a very, very happy day when that happened.
Let's get back
Except for the
such a this
princesses.
meeting.
But I think that's
But-
isn't an important use case. Like if I'm a small HPC site or maybe an individual that just want to control, and I would just want to control what images are used for a specific set of nodes that I have, that I don't need to maintain my own layers for all the images I want to use.
It's a
Well, the
good thing to
classical
maintain
solution
your
to that,
layers.
one would argue that like you want to maintain that control, or the classical solution would be like the manifests are local content, but the layers are in oh my God, I cannot, in an LRU cache, and are, you know, if the layers are missing, they're pulled on a pull through basis. So the registry will pull them for you on your behalf, and then we'll garbage collect them based on usage, and then, you know, maintain a pool of whatever the hot content is. Like, that's a pretty common workflow today. But just before we get too far off that, I just wanted to basically read back Vanessa's comments to her. Like, if I'm understanding it, it's basically that a lot of us who feel very strongly about the whole like putting this in the manifest list and whatnot perspective, we're coming from the containers world and have a very strong understanding of the container image as the primary function of OCI content. And you know, and more or less, if I'm understanding, like, you're not strongly opposed to any of the proposals, though you do have some that you prefer more, but more than anything else, you want to make sure that we're not unintentionally significantly advantaging container workflows and disadvantaging artifact or non-container image content workflows with whatever is decided on. Like, that seems to be the
Exactly.
gist of it, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. I think what very likely could happen is that, you know, OCI comes up with a working group specification. I think the HPC communities are the communities that I kind of speak for. We really want to have a voice in these specifications, and we want to use them for our purposes. And what I don't want to happen, which may happen, and then we would just, I guess, deal with that scenario, is that something is developed that doesn't work for us. So we wind up building our own separate tools, for example, to do the image selection, to integrate into our scheduler. And again, the two communities may stay very kind of separated in that respect.
So
that
like reducing undifferentiated work almost, like, if we can come up with it once, you know, yeah, not forcing the HPC world to come up with its own thing because it doesn't translate well.
I'd say limit the amount of undifferentiated work that is done in HPC, because it's going to be done anyways, right, Vanessa? I mean, we are not...
but try to like
limit it.
make the Venn diagram more of a circle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or so if I like to understand the perspective you have too, like I It almost seems like the purpose of the OCI registry in the HPC world, like the way that it's conceptualized, maybe, or at least here's my mental model, is more of like a replacement, say, for the S3 API, which has sort of become like a lingua franca for like I need to put and get some content in an object store. Now, obviously, there are semantic differences and there's different improvements and regressions, I guess, for that use case. But the idea is that like a OCI registry can become a generic way to provide a storage and retrieval service that is content digested to a compute cluster for storing arbitrary content in the way
Yeah, and
that
that's
like
already
a S3 compatible API is a common utility service in any sort of computing environment today.
Yeah, and that's already happening with things outside of HPC with Aura. So for example, Conda Forge, the Conda mirrors are hosted in OCI. Those aren't images. Those are JSON blobs. Those are Conda packages. And yes, there are use cases for binaries, but you know, we also use containers a lot in HPC. And then the particular problem there is that often the metadata or the detailed metadata that we care about is different than what, for example, the person that is pushing the image, so NVIDIA, would care about. And so if it's developed in a way so that we are not empowered to define and put our metadata somewhere where we can use it as well, then that would be problematic. So we definitely are using containers, but we have these sort of off the shelf other use cases as well. And I would say that there's, even outside of HPC, you know, the Conda mirrors example, there are many different package managers generally that have some kind of artifact they need to put somewhere, and Aurus is totally fantastic for that in OCI registries.
Yeah, but I won't go that far, like as saying it's a common way of distributing information or data. It's for the software piece, right? It's not a store that holds like the data that someone is computing with. It's just, in quotes, providing the software, right? Application data.
Yeah, I
So-
don't mean data containers. Our data is probably too big for that. I meant more just as for binaries.
So let me ask one question. Which container runtime is being used by HPC? You have your own
We have a ton. So a lot of centers use Singularity. Podman is sort of closest to Docker, but it has different issues when you're using it. Some of the centers, there's another one called Charlie Cloud, Shifter.
Cyrus.
Yeah, there's a whole gamut. If you think of the containers,
Well,
the actual container technology story, it's pretty interesting because the reason that we developed all of these sort of off-label, you know, like the reason that we developed all these tools in the first place is because we weren't involved in the early conversations with these standards groups, and we didn't voice our needs early on. So we sort of had to kind of react after the fact. Be like, oh, well, we're not going to run a root daemon on an HPC cluster. So now let's go back and redo everything and make all these new tools. And so it's kind of a fractured landscape. And so that's why it's so important kind of moving forward that we're part of this discussion. That's why like Christian and I are here, for example, and others as well from the HPC communities. We want to be a part of it. Sorry, I'll get off my soapbox now.
I will mention too, like some of those examples, I just don't know. Not to discount their importance or anything. It's just that like, you know, like there's a lot of people have like very definitions of what compatibility means, not in the context of this working group, but I mean, like, for example, Singularity is compatible with OCI images. But what that actually means is like, it doesn't at all follow the specification for transforming an OCI image to a realized container environment. And instead, it's really just compatible with OCI as like a flattened tarball. It knows how to unpack the tarball, apply the whiteouts, and compose a rootfs. It's the same kind of compatibility that LXC or systemd spawn have with OCI content, which is like, this is a new format for packing a rootfs, just kind of like how they knew how to mount an ISO and extract a rootfs from it. But
yeah, and that's because it was done after the fact, like in retrospect, like everything was sort of reactive after the fact.
Right, like there's all these images floating around now, and like people find them really convenient and useful, and like even some of the rootfs I want to use are only published in this format, but you know, my tools weren't designed to understand it because they have a different model. Yeah.
Yeah.
Trying to get away from that. That makes sense.
Yeah, so Podman is probably closest. Podman has layers as opposed to Singularity, which is one CIF binary, which is a squash FS based file system.
Okay, understood.
I mean, and this is just like I slight thing, but like, you know, because maybe people don't have the context too. Podman and Docker aren't that different. Like, I mean, yeah, not just the layers thing. Like Podman is a hard fork of Docker from 6 years ago or so.
Yeah,
And
it was released like
likewise,
2018.
like Docker has a rootless mode. Like there are some very interesting architectural opinions and quirks. Like for example, Podman has like kind of like broken up the classic builder into separate parts, and Podman has decoupled the networking stack from the rest of the program. But like, you know, overall they're actually very similar programs, like to the point where Podman has a daemon. It just runs one tiny little daemon that holds standard input and output open per container, and then knows how to rediscover them. Whereas Docker runs that same daemon, but it doesn't rediscover them. It just keeps a socket open to them, and it doesn't connect and disconnect. Like but fundamentally they're actually very similar.
Yeah, to be fair, I mean, most HPC runtimes, they're doing the same thing anyways, right? They are just doing it in slightly different ways. And
Okay, guys.
but
Sorry,
anyhow,
I
mean, we're going off track.
I
That's
have
like
to. Yeah, exactly. So
a beer
let's
discussion, I think.
let's continue with requirements in that case. I mean, because I would like to go through the list that we have the same understanding about the proposal and how this solves our requirements in that case. So if nobody else has a better idea than going through all of them point by point, I would suggest that we are doing that right now.
Let's do it. Sure.
I can at least, you know, if it makes sense, keep it simple and quick, I can point out all the different italicized things at the end where it might be kind of in between discussion areas.
Okay, be my guests and go on.
So like for the first one, if people want to be able to modify it after the fact, this is a discussion we were just having, and I said, yes, you can do it, but it does recreate the index. And so there's this scenario where you copy down the image, you make a new index with your different annotations in there. And so it has its own digest. It does mean you lose signing, you lose any other upstream stuff unless you modify it all and re-sign it yourself. But that is one of the options is there is just kind of like an in-between state where it's not quite the external refers that some people might be looking for.
I guess my question there is what's the toil of that? Because most people are like, you know, Docker build, Docker push. And so that's like, well, I don't really want to push the image. So well, yeah, I need to use now this custom tool that's not going to repush the image, but it's so that there's a little bit of more image author toil there in the sense that they have to do something special.
The same toil that you would have for having a tool that pushes or refers, because you're going to have some tool that creates a manifest and pushes it up to the registry that sits alongside and that defines the subject and everything else. Any tooling could do that, could just as easily recreate an index and push in a couple extra annotations in there.
Okay. I guess I would argue that the tooling situation would probably be a little bit better just because it would have to be more tightly integrated with the build process, at least in the case of I as the original author am authoring this metadata. You're still going to want like, you know, better tools to munge a manifest to do the modification for, you know, for local modifications. But in the case of the happy path of the author is the author of everything, including the metadata, you know, having it more integrated into the tool that generates the manifest list is probably a better tooling experience than having a sidecar that uploads a metadata sidecar, like a sidecar program that uploads sidecar metadata.
I am one of those people that writes that tooling that munges stuff after the fact, so I might be slightly biased here. There are a few things in here where we're asking for tooling, and almost all of them I said, you know, for example, a third one that's unchecked there that says, as an image author, I want to provide a tool that does X, Y, Z. And I didn't check that, just saying, hey, the tooling is going to be external people building this. So a runtime maintainer is going to update their runtime to be able to do this stuff. The build tooling maintainer is going to update their stuff to work with this. Maybe someone will come out with a third-party tool that can munge existing images, but it wouldn't be provided by OCI per se. It would just be OCI saying, hey, all these tools exist. Use them because they're all following the spec.
And for a lot of people, it would probably be Like at this point, AppCo or BuildKit would probably be the tools that we're talking about here.
I like that we keep using the word munge.
Okay. So I guess the next steps for this proposal would be, I'm not sure if Vanessa, you want to continue your discussions with your questions on the proposal itself, because the proposal from my point of view looks good to me. I would vote for merge that. But if you want to still continue discussing stuff in there, I would just keep it open and continue the discussion there.
Oh yeah, so I guess so what we're doing now is we're just kind of vetting the completeness of the proposal. We're not really going into the, oh yeah. Yeah, no, I think
as
we
well
can
as
discuss. I was gonna say, I think we need to discuss the requirements a lot more, but in terms of the completeness of the proposal, yeah, merging is.
I mean, the final solution will be decided later, right? We are just checking if the proposal is valid or not.
I totally missed that. I thought we were like going through them all in detail.
And unambiguous, I think, is the other thing. Like, at least for me, the bigger thing is that like everybody agrees on the language and has a clear idea of what it means and doesn't mean is kind of the kind of review here.
The other part I want to make sure of is that if I checked a box that said I fulfill this requirement and people are looking at it saying, that wasn't the way I understood the requirement, this would be a good time to make sure that we're all on the same page of what it means to satisfy a requirement.
Yeah, that's why I thought we were going to go through the requirements bullets in sort of more detail.
I'm not sure we have enough time for that because we have 3 minutes left, but I would do it this way. I mean, let's keep it for a while open because I also posted the message on the general Slack channel, and let's go carefully bullet by bullet ourselves offline. And the next time, if there are any concerns, we can talk about that. And then we will discuss as well about proposal B, but this time I will be better moderator.
I kind of think we should go through the bullets together. Like when I was doing this for my proposal, I feel like my perspective could have missed something, if that makes sense.
I mean,
For
okay.
example, there are a few of these that I checked off when I was doing it, saying that, hey, as a security administrator, I want to make sure people can't go through and change stuff after the fact. It was relying on the fact that you sign that original image, you put your stamp of approval on there, and if someone changes it, they're building a new index, they're modifying the image, so it's no longer signed by the original author, which prevents someone from potentially going in here and changing the compatibility spec, you know, the annotations associated with it to run a different image than would normally be executed. And so that was one of the goals here of making sure that I couldn't modify it after the fact. That let me check some of these things off.
Yeah, Marcine, I think it's up to you. If you want, we can just kind of vet the high level kind of completeness of the proposal, merge it, and then go through the requirements together later. Or we can have that be part of the PR review. I think it depends how you want to organize the discussion.
I would still wait with merging that because I want to give other a chance to reply to that to all our proposals. But I'm okay if you want to go bullet by bullet on the next meeting, fine by me. We have to do it right. So even if it takes time,
I'd like to do that.
then fine by me. I hope it's just not gonna take us almost 3 months with use cases like use cases last time.
You know what? I think we're doing
there
a
is
good
the
job.
option
We're
too.
making progress.
I think there is the option too, Marcin, of like, calendars supporting to try and set up, more longer or probably ideally like more frequent times. Like, while we're working through the proposals, let's do like 2 calls a week. And, each call will have a proposal as the topic. And the goal will be to make sure, kind of more or less skim through it and not discuss all the points necessarily, but either make sure that everybody's aligned, or if there are questions, that at least the questions are surfaced, if not fully answered, in the name of timeliness, like something like that, probably too, as kind of a discovery process, to Vanessa's point, to make sure that, they're kind of that rubber ducky stage of going back through with fresh eyes, but, in the name of timeliness, maybe not doing all the follow-up discussion synchronously.
But I guess if we go to like the first, the second, and the third, we will like sound like a broken record for most things anyways, right? I think we will come to common idea, hopefully eventually, by discussing many proposals. I would hope.
Yeah, and I can, so I put in 2 proposals and I like my second one better, so we can just skip my third one.
Let me
If
propose this, that we use the meantime to review any of the outstanding PR comments or review questions and whatnot. And that way we can not go line by line, but we go through any of the computational questions and confusion in here.
Okay, sounds good. I mean, so this is what we are doing to just summarize all of these opinions. We are not going to set up the second meeting yet. If we receive it's required in the future, maybe. But let's go asking discussions as Brandon mentioned in the GitHub. And if anybody has some concerns on the next Monday meeting, we will go with specific points that raise the concern. Is that okay, or do you had something different in mind, Brandon?
I was going to see if we could finish up proposal A and just resolve any remaining conversations on this right now. And that way, next
Yeah, why
meeting
couldn't we
can
go
queue
through
up
the
for
bullets like
proposal.
today now? Why did we pause and stop? We have 10 minutes, well, 9 minutes now.
Basically, we
Yes.
have 0 time because the meeting is 50 minutes.
We always go
Oh,
to the
there's
hour
people
though.
Yeah. Let me check
When-
quickly. But that's okay. If you have time till 8, I'm fine by that.
I honest to God did not know this was 50 minutes because we go to the hour every time. And
The Docker's maintainers call is an hour, but it always goes at least 2, if not 3. I have a 2-hour block on it after my calendar because it's one of those that we refuse to update the end.
There was one set of comments on there asking about basically scoping the annotations, but also was asking about how do we do some of the selection there if it gets more complex and in or scenarios, things like that. And I'm wondering if we've gotten this at least answered enough to mark that conversation resolved, or if I'm still have points in here that I have not addressed.
so is this the sort of idea of like there could be some kind of graph selection needed? Like I want this or that. And there's no this and this is problematic when you have sort of a flat list of annotations. Was that the gist, or I don't remember the discussion.
So I think a bunch of them were your questions in there asking about more complex scenarios. And the way that I'll resolve this right now with what I've got is, since I can have some kind of weighted ranking, that you would weight the ones that are more important to you. And since I can add them together, I can add together multiple ranks. If there's like the AMD on NVIDIA versus the Intel on NVIDIA, or pick our scenario choice. And the runtime can say, I really want this one more than the others based off of what it needs. Or maybe it doesn't want the one for Intel. Maybe it does a negative ranking in there. So I'm wondering if that's at least enough to say that the proposal addresses as good as it's going to be able to get addressed with the proposal.
Yeah, so from my point of view, this proposal doesn't solve more complex use cases that we were expecting at the first, but from telco use cases, we expect a little bit different from, we have different expectations from compatibility spec, not regarding image selection. So what you propose, Brandon, is good enough for me because in there we don't have so many specialized images that we have to improve significantly the image selection itself. We just need to validate host against the compatibility specification. So what you have in here, it's good for us.
Yeah, this does not do the node provisioning or node selection.
So I would say, from my point of view, this could be resolved, unless Vanessa is against that because of HPC use cases.
I just haven't read that discussion since January early, so I have to look at it again.
It's basically the idea of having some kind of logic of a graph that you can express compatibility, like as Brandon mentioned, Intel running on AMD. Intel running with NVIDIA GPU, having specific kernel modules. If not, then fall back to different graph paths to check if their other compatibilities are fulfilled and so on.
Yeah, I think the issue is that That makes sense. So I think the issue for me is that, let's say that you come upon this flat list of annotations, and let's say that there's some kind of meaningful relationship between them that you need to understand in order to schedule. As they are, there's no way to say, let me look up the schema that describes the graph and the relationships between these things. It's just a flat list. And so the most complex thing you can do is like matching labels. And maybe that's fine for the most simplest of use cases, but it's just very simple, I guess. Like I don't see that it would
Is
fit a lot of.
there, I guess, like, is there a concrete example of a case that wouldn't work with matching labels that you have in mind? Because at least that's, I mean, you know, I would be the first person to say that there's a lot of deep flaws in the Kubernetes ecosystem. But I guess the flip side of that is that, you know, like the scheduling constraints in Kubernetes have been very productive for a lot of people for a long time with a simple expression language and labels.
Yeah, so the
And
simplest use
this maps
case,
very well onto like extending versus trying to rewrite what already exists.
so a really simple use case is back again to ArchSpec, where you may get a particular, architecture that's hard coded in your label, but you need to look up the graph to see like, okay, is this specific one that I have in the family that I can support? And so
would that be saying like because so I guess if I'm understanding, it's like say that I have like a x86 64 v3 that's not decomposed into all the families that fulfill that, especially because that may not be exhaustive. And then the question is, does Haswell support this instruction set?
Yeah,
For example,
something simple like that. But the issue with that particular example is that it's incredibly simple. It's like one attribute that you really just need to look up sort of its relationship in some kind of tree. The better use case, and I can
gotta
try
run,
to
guys.
write.
See you next week.
Oh yeah, bye Christian. The better use case is just the fact that when we do scheduling with our schedule with Flux, we have a graph, and all of each resource type is called a subsystem. So for example, there's an IO or storage subsystem, there's power. And so when we do a compatibility selection case, we're not just like matching an architecture, we're kind of putting together many different graphs into one, and then also understanding the relationship. So like, okay, this PCI bus is close to this GPU, and that's like really important. And so we need these two things, and they need to be related in this particular way. So I don't
we could
have
even be talking about like so like you have a much more complex scheduling model, and the problem is just that like there's a lossy mapping here. If we go to something simple and then you try to map it back, because if I'm understanding, like you have scheduling constraints that could even be like, I don't know, how many NUMA nodes are there, or like how much memory is available in a single NUMA node, or something like that. That's like much more topological and much more complex than simple like binary. Do I support this instruction set or not?
Yeah.
Or do I support this this capability or not?
Topology is a really good example because, it's not something that Kubernetes is, well, originally was great at. I think there's a lot of proposals coming in now that better consider topology in the scheduler, but it's still not the same level as we desire for HPC.
They're still struggling with power aware scheduling, let alone topology. So yeah, it's just not as much. I mean, the entire like cloud world is so predicated on homogeneous systems and hardware that, kind of like a heterogeneous environment where you're trying to eke every last bit of performance out by having knowledge of the hardware architecture and making smart decisions based on that. That's still a little bit of an out of context problem for a lot of us in the cloud world, I guess.
Yeah.
So 1 minute left here. I'm going to leave the last action item to go back through some of these things. If we have resolved all the conversations, let's go ahead and flag them as we're resolving, we're good with this. We don't have any remaining questions, or if they aren't, maybe rephrase it and say, hey, here's a concrete example of exactly what the problem is this that we're looking for.
I think though for a lot of them, they aren't going to have a resolution. It will just be like, okay, we understand that this is a very simple design and it's not going to meet all of these use cases. And I think we could probably still resolve it, but
they're more like these are pros or cons of like this may not meet this may only meet 80% of the desired of the desired things for the HPC folks and not 100. So though this proposal might be acceptable, like it might require ecosystem specific overlays on top or further revision to be, solve all the like I think that's what you're saying, right? Like some of them might just be fundamental and they're more observations about the suitability than actually does this do what the author says it does in a way that everybody agrees on.
Yeah, I would make sure that we have just at least clarified what the proposal is. And as long as we know what the proposal is, then we can move forward.
Okay, so I have two notes. First one, so Vanessa, you said you don't like your your first proposal, right? Are you planning to close it or keep it?
Yeah, I can close it. I'm gonna look it over one more time to make sure that there wasn't something that I liked in it that I didn't like pass forward to my second round of. Yeah, I will close it after, but I want to look at it one more time.
Okay, so the second note, because my proposal changed a lot. At the beginning, I was thinking too big, and I closed many discussions that I thought are not related to the new proposal that I made. So if you are thinking that some discussions should be reopened, please do that.
Oh yeah, we can look again at yours. I saw that you were doing a lot of work on it and I haven't looked at it again, so I will absolutely do that.
Cool. So talk you then on the next meeting, and next time I will be moderating very hard. So
yeah, you got it. We were like punching each other. Anyway, happy Monday, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Cheers all.
Bye.